What's up, guys? Doug Polk here, and today we're going to be breaking down a pretty awesome hand that I saw from the $100,000 World Series of Poker bracelet event. This hand happened three-handed with a lot of the chips on the line. On that note, let's go ahead and jump into the action. To briefly set the table before we jump into the hand, there are currently 3 players left. Payouts are $2.6 million for first, $1.6 million for second, and $1.1 million for third. So every player is guaranteed $1.1 million, but there are a couple of jumps here. And this hand is going to happen between 2 players that have more chips than the third player, meaning there is some ICM pressure between them. Although that doesn't become too important in this hand, certainly something to note. Anyway, our hand begins three-handed. The button looks down at Jack 9 offsuit. We're playing 200K, 400K with a 400K ante. This is definitely a hand you're going to want to be playing on the button. Players are quite deep. They still have 50 or 60 blinds effective between the chip leader and the second place, 50 blinds effective. So this is a hand that you're going to want to be opening the button. It's getting down there in hands you want to play, but still certainly strong enough. If you had a hand like maybe 8-6 off, you're going to be folding. Somewhere around 10-8 off is going to be your cutoff. 9-7 off is going to be your cutoff. Anyway, this hand definitely wants to open, and he does make it 800K. Mateos looks down the small blind at King 10 suited. Interesting spot here pre-flop. I do think this is a situation where you could certainly argue for 3-bet or call. One of the things when you get to this 50 blind stack that's important to note is that you want to be 3-betting slightly more polarized than maybe on some other stack depths. Basically, if King 10 suited 3-bets and gets 4-bet or really realistically probably jammed on, it's a disaster. You're going to fold a ton of equity. You don't want to allow that to happen and let a hand like pocket 8s or maybe ace queen knock you off your equity, possibly even some bluffs where you have pretty good equity as well. So this hand probably does prefer to flat, and Mateos does decide to ultimately make the call. Over to carry, big blind 10-7 of hearts. This is a hand that mainly does like to call as well. You could maybe argue every now and again making a little move here pre-flop with a suited gapper, but I do prefer call. You're getting great odds. It's certainly going to be a profitable play. He does call, and let's take a flop. The flop comes Jack 9, a huge flop for Jack 9, flopping the absolute stone cold nuts. And if you like to watch people flopping the stone cold nuts in a tournament, or perhaps punching people in the nuts, you can head on over now to watch daily PokerGo content highlights on their YouTube channel, or you can watch their entire offering of live streaming events, such as the World Series of Poker, High Stakes Poker, and much more. I'll put a link in the description below. All right, back to the hand here. Both out-of-position players are going to check over to the pre-flop raiser, certainly the standard play. Jack high paired boards, as the pre-flop raiser, you're going to want to bet these flops quite often. However, on Jack 9, there's a lot of draws going on. It does make sense to have some more checks. And Jack 9 specifically does actually like to check here some of the time. As you get into shorter stack situations, you want to be betting a little bit more polarized so that if your opponent has a good hand themselves, you can easily fold or continue versus a raise. With Jack 9, of course, you are at the top of the polarization. You have the nuts, but you do want players to try and bluff and come after you. You can call down any run out, and you have what will be effectively roughly the nuts on just about any board. If you have a hand like pocket 9s, you're going to prefer to bet because it's much more likely your opponent has a hand like a jack, like for example, Jack 10, Queen Jack, and you want to get paid. Or perhaps if you have a hand like Ace Jack, you're a little more worried about draws. You have a hand that's a bit more vulnerable, that kind of thing. So with all of your good hands that you can have, pocket jacks or Jack 9 are the kind of hands you like to check back and trap. And of course, you can always look to raise later. This will also give you an ability to bluff in those lines, which is going to be important if you're a good player. But we don't have to be worried about bluffing here because we flopped the stone nuts. Anyway, Arends does decide to go ahead and check back the flop, which I like, and let's take a turn. The turn comes the deuce of clubs, 2 flush draws now on board. This is an interesting spot for both Mateos and Katz if it checks to them, but it's not going to check to Katz because Mateos takes the betting lead. On these 2 flush draw boards, typically speaking, my study has indicated that bigger sizes like to be preferred, with something like 2/3 pot being roughly what you want to bet. Mateos obviously agrees in some capacity, betting 2/3 pot himself here with his gut shot to the straight. Now, I will say here, you do prefer to have a hand with a club or spade. You also do prefer to have the flush draw hands or the open enders like Queen 10 suited or 10-8 suited. spades, clubs, all that kind of thing. However, King 10 does have some good connectivity to the board where you do block some of the hands that can check back and call turn. So this hand is a reasonable betting candidate, although if you always bet a hand like this, opponents could certainly come after you by raising you or playing generally loose against it. Carry with just a gut shot with two flushers out there, pretty standard fold. He does lay it down, and now the action over to the button, who decides just to go ahead and slow play. I don't think you want to raise any hands here versus a 2/3 pot size. You either play call or you play fold. Mateos had to bet into two players, so I don't see much reason to do anything other than call. Arends does decide to make the call, and let's take a river. The river comes the queen of spades. And this is where the hand gets really interesting and why I wanted to break it down. When a card comes like this that changes the river, and really just kind of in general in poker when you're out of position, you typically speaking want to have two sizes. A small size, which will be something like a quarter pot to a third pot here. So let's just say something like 1.6 to 2.2 million. And then you also want to have a big size, something that will be more like a 4.4 to 4.8 or even 5 million kind of size. The logic is simple. When you have a really good hand that does not block hands from calling. So like, for example, let's say he has ace 7 of spades, or he has, let's just say he has a hand like pocket twos, or maybe he has a hand like maybe king 10 with a spade where he thinks a flush is less likely. Hands like that will typically prefer to go for a bigger size to try and get value. If Mateos has a hand like just a jack, well, those hands will like a smaller size so that he can get called by maybe aces that check back the flop, or ace 9, or queen 9, or pocket kings. There are a bunch of hands that could consider a hero call that simply don't want to face a very large size. So by betting small with some hands and big with others, we can get more value with our good hands, and we can get thinner value with our thin value bets. And then when Mateos has a hand like queen jack or jack 9 or pocket nines, he can go for a size that's a small size hoping to get raised. This is where the hand really goes off the rails. Arends now decides to go to 12 million chips. And I'm going to pause for a moment. I don't love this size. I think I would really prefer to go either smaller or just go all in. I think the logic makes sense. If I have a hand like a flush and I'm in Arends' shoes, I want to go a size that's smaller to allow room to get called by hands like a jack or straights. If I have a straight, I don't really want to raise the situation. Yeah, you probably could raise king 10 with a spade because it's a little more likely Mateos has a hand like a straight or a jack when he goes the small river size. So I don't hate that idea. But overall, you don't have that many hands that would prefer to go a 12 million chip size that don't want to just go all in. If Arends has the nut flush or a full house, he probably just wants to jam. And this also allows him to put his opponent in an intense ICM situation where Mateos calls, he likely goes from being the chip leader to getting a very likely third place. So in my opinion, the sizes here in position on the button should be something like 6-7 million or a full $20 million or 20 million chip jam. And I would mainly jam this hand with a little bit of raise. But back to what Arends decided to do, which was a 12 million chip raise. It's kind of an interesting situation, interesting size, and not something you see all too often. Anyway, back over to Mateos. We can unpause now. This is a brutal scenario. You have a rivered straight. You thought it was one of the best rivers in the deck for you, but honestly, this was just a cooler. But the flush has gotten in. Now, if I'm in Mateos' shoes here, I'm thinking to myself, going back to what I thought about before we bet, what hands would I use my small size with, and what hands would I use my big size with? With king 10, I'm mainly putting it in my small size, right? So my straights are mainly going to be in the small size. Hands like a flush or a boat are mainly going to be in my big size. So I'm probably going to need to be making some uncomfortable calls versus a raise of this size. However, the first thing I want to think about after that is, what is my opponent representing? And realistically for this size, it's somewhere in the vicinity of around a flush, a middling-ish flush. I think when he raises this big, it's unlikely to be a low flush or king 10. It's just a bit too thin to go for so much value. I think Arends is saying I got something in the vicinity of a 10 high flush or better when he goes this size. So what I'm thinking to myself now in Mateos' shoes is, what hands do I have that I can call with that have better card removal? My opponent is risking 12 million to win about 8 million. So I can fold a lot of the time. I can fold about 60% of the time, something in that vicinity, and be totally okay. I'm going to fold my bluffs. Now I have to think, what hands do I want to fold? Well, I would kind of start with my straights, because if I think that Arends either has a boat or a flush here, I don't want to have a straight. Let's say that I'm Mateos and I have Jack 10 here. Jack 10 is a much nicer hand to call with. Let's say he has Jack 10 with the 10 being a spade. Now that'd be kind of loose pre-flop, so he might not have that, but let's just say in theory he had that. I block the boats with the Jack. I block the flushes with the 10 of spades. That hand makes a lot of sense to call for its removal properties. What if I just had King Jack? Well, having that Jack is really important. It's much less likely my opponent has a hand like Jack 9, and I know they don't have a hand like pocket Jacks. What if I have a hand that's like, for example, King 10, King of Spades? Again, maybe a little bit too loose pre-flop, but that hand then blocks those high flushes. So as I go through all of my hands, I'm going to fold my bluffs, which should only be a small part of my range, given I bet my small size. Within all of my value bets, 10-8 suited, King 10 suited, or King 10 off, depending on how he's playing pre-flop, flushes, a Jack. This strikes me as one of my worst hands to call with, so personally, I would fold. I would look to call when I have a hand like a Jack, or maybe a Jack with a spade, or if I had a flush, because my opponent could certainly be raising a strong flush to this size. Mateos, if he has King 10 of diamonds, well, he could definitely have King 10 of spades, 10-8 of spades, 8-7 of spades, maybe some Ace-X of spades, depending on how loose he's going to play in the small blind, maybe even a hand like King 8 of spades. So there are plenty of other hands that Mateos can have here that actually are doing just fine. And one more important thing here. If I'm Mateos and I have a hand like Queen Jack, I would also use my small size quite often because I block so much of the board. Or maybe if I had a hand like Ace 10 of spades, I might use my small size some of the time. Or maybe if I had a hand like Jack 9 of diamonds. Where I'm driving with this whole analysis is I liked Mateos' decision to bet turn and use the small river size. And certainly King 10 suited is a stronger hand than a hand like Jack 10. But we have to think about what is our opponent representing and how is our card removal against that hand compared to the range of compared to the range of hands my opponent is representing. Anyway, Mateos ends up making the call and does get to see the bad news. I will note it's possible Mateos had some kind of either live read or knows this player very well or has a lot of history with this player, in which case it might make him feel like he has to make some lighter than equilibrium calls. But putting those things to the side because I don't personally know them, I do feel like this hand would have been a nice one to bet fold. And as we all know, I am known for making my folds. Thank you for joining me today, guys. I will see you again soon. Peace.